Hello and welcome back to my channel, Afric Psych. My name is Funi, and today's topic will be about generational gaps. So I decided that before I tap into the current mental health across the globe, we just need to discuss the different generations in order to understand where you are and where the other person is mentally. So just a quick disclaimer, I need to do extensive research on the different generations in the African continent because the current information that I have is based on Western culture, Western world, and we as Africans just tap into it by default. These are my own opinions and no one else's, and a few from Wikipedia. So I'll start with the greatest generation, which is also known as the GI generation, the generation that has a cool name. So these people were born between 1901 and 1927. I'm not sure if it is the greatest of all times generation, like the GOATs, or they are called the greatest because of the Greatest Depression. That I do not know. They had no time to communicate with anyone or understand what the other person says, according to my opinion, because if you made them angry or pissed them off, they will go to war. The youngest of this group is turning 96 years old in 2023. And if there is still one of them out there who is active on social media, well, that person has very good genes. So we move on to the next generation after the greatest generation, which is called the silent generation. They're also known as the traditionalist generation. I'm going to leave a link to Wikipedia and on the comments so that you can go and read up on everything that you want to know about these generations. So the traditionalist generation was born between 1928 and 1945. Unfortunately, this generation was busy rebuilding what was lost during the greatest generation during the World War II. Maybe they are called the silent generation because they were too afraid to trigger another world war. You never know. The youngest is turning 78 in 2023. And I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to provide therapy sessions for this generation. It is my grandmother's generation, and I don't know much about it because my grandmother died when I was 8 years old, sometime in 1994, after she voted actually. She passed away, so I never really had the opportunity to know this generation, so I can't say much about it. After the silent generation, then came the baby boomers. The baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. So the baby boomers are my mother's generation and my mother-in-law. So they had to navigate life on their own most of the time. And while their parents were trying to deal with the trauma of rebuilding from the silent generation. Remember, the silent generation was rebuilding, so the baby boomers were still reeling over that trauma as well. So it was a changing world for them, so they were trying to navigate that changing world. They are the most difficult when it comes to therapy because they do not want to admit that times have changed and younger generations have voices louder than theirs. If they believe in something, be it culturally, spiritually, etc., it is very difficult to convince them otherwise. And this is my mother. So the next generation that we have is Gen X. Gen X is Generation X, which were born between 1965 and 1980. Some are our parents and some are our siblings. Gen Xers were sometimes called the latchkey generation. I got this from Wikipedia, okay? Which stems from their returning as children to an empty home and needing to use the door key due to reduced adult supervision compared to previous generations. This was a result of increasing divorce rates and increased maternal participation in the workforce prior to the widespread availability of child care options outside the home. So this simply translates to the beginning of the single parent or child-headed households era. So that's where it all began. This generation had to grow up too quickly as the eldest children had to also play their parents' role. I feel sorry for the Gen X's. So we move on to the millennials. So the millennials is my generation. I fall in the millennial generation, and they're also known as Generation Y. Maybe we asked too many questions. No. The Gen Y were born between 1981 and 1996. So they or we are described as the first global generation and the first generation that grew up in the internet age. So the life we are living right now started with this generation. It is the generation that has experienced it all. A lot has changed during this time, their time, and surprisingly, they managed to slot everything into their lives. I call them the blenders because they blend in anywhere. I mean, they are everywhere. We are everywhere. They are not going to be left behind. This generation is also the most struggling one because we're trying to make ends meet and we're trying to survive from everything that happened before our generation, during our generation, and even after. Those are very different times. So we move on to the next generation, which is Generation Z. Gen Z, and we usually call them the 2000s. The Gen Zs are also called the Zoomers. They were born between 1997 and 2010. They are called the digital natives. I mean, they were born into the internet age. They just came into this world and there was the internet. Everything they need to know is at their fingertips. They don't need to communicate with anyone or be physically present. They actually have become detached to the notion of in my time. Like they don't really want to know anything about our times or anybody else's time. All they want is to do things the way they feel that is the right way to do things. So they don't want anything to do with the older generation, the older generation's way of living. So we as a generation wise, we should stop complaining about the Z's because all we need to do is to try and tap into their world and try to understand why they do things the way they do and why they behave the way they do instead of us actually judging them. So they look at life through a zoom lens. They when they want something, they know how to get it and when to get it by any means necessary. They don't look at life on a who says what basis. They want to look at it in their own way and understand it in their own way. Hence, they are called the Zoomers. I'd go the entire day talking about disease, but I'll stop here. If you need more information about this, please go and research it yourself. So we will touch onto the alphas, generation alphas, which are born between 2011 up to 2026. We'll discuss them after the betas are born. So basically, we are starting the Greek alphabet now. Hence, we have the alphas and we're going on to the betas. I belong to the millennial generation, and times are very different from then and now. Some of my peers are still trying to adjust to this change and always revert to the in my time speech, at the time where you get to a point where you have to tell someone that, in my time, this is what I used to do. That's what we are doing actually on a daily basis. And this does not actually sit well with the other generations or rather the Z's because they are the only generation that's after us right now that can tell us a way to get off. In all honesty, with all due respect, no one before or after your time really is interested in your time. The Z's are not interested in what we used to do during our time or how we used to behave during our time because it's not really going to help them much during their time. So us, when we keep on saying in my time, it really, for lack of a better word, pisses them off because it comes off as if we want them to behave the way that we used to behave. We want them to actually do things the way we used to do things. It sounds to them like we don't want to change. Look, it was your time. Like my time was the best time of my life, but that does not mean that it has to be the best time of the Generation Z's life. We all use the in my time speech when we want to sound relevant or be recognized or we want to be right. It is funny because we never use the in my time speech with the older generation. You won't find me sitting with my mother and I would say, in my time, this is what I used to do. I always use this phrase with the younger generation to show them that, you know what, I used to be good like you in my time. So hence I'm saying it's when you want to feel relevant when you speak about this. So my question to you is, if you're going to dwell on in your time, then whose time is it now? Because obviously, if you're going to dwell on in my time, you are not living your current life because you're still reminiscing about the time when you were still the it, and you're trying to prove to the new generation that you are still the it because in your time, that's what you used to do. So it's not good to be dwelling on those memories because you forget to live your life currently. So we should stop reminiscing about the 90s and start actually tapping into the lives of the younger generation, the Zs. By dwelling in my time era, you're actually forgetting to live in the moment. Life is passing you by while you are busy reminiscing about the 90s, how nice it was, how good you were. Don't become a threat to the current stability by trying to keep things the way they were. Times have changed, and change is good. You just need to accept it. So some of these generations do tap into other generations, the one before them or the one after them. I always say it's always good to tap into the generation that came after you. You're the younger generation, because that way you are willing to recognize the change and be part of it. The ones who tap into the older generations are holding on to the past and old ways of living. To them, change is a very scary thing. And once a person is scared to change, then it creates issues, because now they see change as a threat and they will try everything in their power to deal with that threat. So everyone has one or two relatives who are still living in my time era. So just think about how hard it can be to have a decent conversation with someone who's still in that in my time era, because your opinion to them comes off as disrespectful, or it comes off as if you don't want to understand where they're coming from and you're trying to change their entire world. So in closing, this should not be taken out of context, most of the generational gap issues start with your immediate family. You need to understand that family is not everything. And if your family is a threat to your mental and emotional well-being, you do not need to keep up the pretense that they are everything. Your mental well-being and emotional health and the relationship you have with yourself should be your first priority. Abusive family dynamics do not need to be part of your life just because of different generational beliefs and the in my time notion. A lot of us are stuck in toxic family relationships because we are trying to respect our elders. And it's not really respecting our elders, but we are respecting their in my time speeches. So we're trying to make sure that everything that they tell us about their time, we keep to that, because if we try and question that, it is seen as disrespectful. We are too scared to be who we aspire to be because it might be perceived as disrespectful. So that means you're not living your life. You're trying to please your family. So when are you going to let go of the burden of living your life according to the older generation's time? And by doing so, if you're living according to your generation's time, it means you are not living, you are just alive for the sake of just being alive. You do not need to be in close proximity with your family members in order to show them that you love them. It is okay sometimes to love your loved ones from afar. Sometimes it's the most healthiest thing to do, to actually love them from afar, because once you are closer to them, that's when you will have to prove how much you respect them and how much you love them. When you love someone, you don't need to prove it. They can just see that you do love them. Thank you so much for watching to the end, and please do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Click like and also comment, because your comments, either they're good or bad, positive or negative, they will help me grow.